everybody. Today we are having a special lecture for the sign language series on the girl child. I am accompanied by Manisha Sharma, and we are discussing about why is it that there is a certain focus on the girl child and what were the reasons for international institutions like the UN, various state governments, NGOs, developmental sector to focus on the girl child. There is a long history to this, and studies have shown that the special situation of the girl child has to be linked to what we call social structure. How is society organized? What is the line of descent, by which we mean how does the name of the family go from one generation to the other? Is it patrilineal, father to son to grandson, or is it matrilineal, grandmother to granddaughter? And our findings suggest that in a patriarchal, in a patrilineal, in a patrilocal society, there is substantial vulnerabilities about the girl child. However, the status of all girl children are not the same. It would also depend upon the class, race, caste, ethnic group to which the girl child belonged, because within society, the dominant norms which govern a particular section may vary from one group to another. And further, the kind of restrictions which would be imposed upon the girl child in one situation would be different from another depending upon the location within the social structure. I am going to begin with a quotation from 19th century India about child widows. As I had mentioned in another lecture, there was a lot of focus on child widows in the 19th century social reform movement. In Bengal, we had Vivekanand. In Maharashtra, we had Ranade. In the south, we had Virasalingam. And we had many stories about the anti-caste movements where the issue of child widows and the discrimination was foregrounded. We have stories, the pioneering role by Savitribai Phule when she set about a school for girl children. So there is a very long history, and the observation about a social reformer of the 19th century on child widow is extremely illustrative. It tells us a lot about social structure as well as social ideas. I quote, "Their situation, that is the situation of widows, become one of utter helplessness, and the result will be that they yield to temptation, and many of them become women of abandoned character, and thus swell the ranks of prostitutes, leaving an indelible blot on the honor of those who claim any relationship whatever with them." In this entire extract, I want to draw your attention to certain terms. One, you have utter helplessness. They have nowhere to go. They are completely dependent on others, and in such a situation, the reformer says they may be tempted and then may become what is called abandoned character, loose women, and join the ranks of the prostitution. Unfortunately, the focus is not on her sorrows as much as it is on the dishonor or the blot on the relatives of those people. This is very unfortunate story, and one of the earliest books to refer to this hypocrisy is by Tarabai Shinde called Stri Purush Tulana in Marathi in the 1800s. The story here begins with a very well-known kind of news report about a little baby which was dumped in the garbage, and people started speculating that whose baby it was. And finally, when they found out who this was, she was a widow from a privileged family, and there was severe punishment meted out to her. And Tarabai Shinde asks, but what about the men? Nobody asks the questions. So you have a very complicated relationship of widows, child widows in a society which is patriarchal and which very often has very kind of double standards about how they will judge the moral character of men as against the moral character of women. There is also a lot of relationships, something which we often overlook. Very often when people discuss issues of gender, women, girl, child, they will say mindset badalna chahiye. They should change the mindset. The issue is not just of a mindset, the issue is also of a social structure, because only mindset will not change unless we have the structure changing. So as long as the line of descent or law says the property has to follow from the father to the son to the grandson, or you have certain privileges given to the men, it would be very difficult, even if one wishes to change the mindset, though changing mindset is also very important. Now, the reason I give this point about mindset is to show to you that there are social reasons or causes between the plight of child widows and macroeconomics or macro politics. One small example, if you know, in the 19th century we had British colonialism and a lot of famines. Lots of people died, suffered. 1896-97, we had a very, very severe famine. And many people will ask, what is the connection between famine and widows? But studies have shown that many of these widows, because of the famines, were pushed to work and no work was coming. And there was a lot of deaths during this period reported in the 1901 Punjab census. During the famine years, reports increased of the sale of women and sale of children. Sale of women and children always increase during crisis, whether they are famines or whether they are pandemic like the COVID-19. Why does that happen? It happens because even in normal times, even in ordinary normal times, the girl child is in a vulnerable position. She is in a situation of greater risk. In a crisis, it becomes more visible and becomes more dramatic. For example, there is a male bias in society. Everybody wants a boy child. But it's only when you have certain kind of technological possibilities of amniocentesis and female feticide that it will arise. So there's a relation between macro changes in economy, technology, as well as the day status of the girl child. So it's a complicated situation. It's not just about telling nice stories about the girl child, but explaining the social reasons or structural reasons for this vulnerability and how in periods of crisis this vulnerability increases. What kind of vulnerability? And let us tell the story from the time a girl child is born or a girl child is not born. What do I mean by saying a girl child is not born? For example, a lot of girls, there's female feticide means that once the parents get to know that the fetus is a girl, her chances of being born itself is reduced. And all of you know what they call the girls missing at birth, that the number of girls who are not born because they are terminated even before birth. The sex ratio, therefore, in our country deteriorated, though there has been a lot of efforts at the state level, at the NGO level, and yet the persistence of a declining child sex ratio has increased. This in turn has led to trafficking. You have questions of girls being bought for marriage by men in those regions where there are not enough girls. You may have heard about studies from West UP, Haryana, where they would have bought girls from Assam, from Bengal, from Orissa, and brought over here because there are no marriageable girls. So when we talk about the girl child, we have to always relate it to the social structures and the ideas which exist in society. So very often people would say that a girl child, if she is born, is very lucky, lucky to be born. The struggle of a girl child begins therefore even before the day she is conceived. Female feticide is a worrying practice, as cheap abortion technology allows households to exercise their preference for sons over daughters. Earlier it was female infanticide because it had to be done other than through technology, whereas now it is done through technology. So the girl child is lucky if she is allowed to be born. Then we have data that once she is born, the chances of survival for the girl child is less, because there are studies which show gender differences when is a girl taken to a hospital as compared to a boy who is sick. Hospital data of boy children who are admitted to hospitals for treatment as compared to girl children. Nutritional differences between boy child and girl child. And then of course when we reach the stage of going to school, we find that while there has been a growth, there has been a positive growth in female population enrollment in schools, we have a dropout rate, that they go to school, they enroll in school, but very often they drop out after elementary education. Thousands of girls drop out of school after attaining puberty. Very often they're married off. Parents are worried that would she be safe if something happens to her, what will happen to the honor of the family, what will happen to the girl, will she marry or will she be married or not. So the burden of her being a chaste girl or a good girl rests on the girl herself. Society would say, but who asked her to go to school? So you have all the stakes, so to say, against that. So you have chances of not being born. Number two, once being born, chances of actually surviving being less. Then when you go to school, you have greater rate of dropout for girls. Growing up, puberty, education and the girl child constantly shows that after a certain age, women drop out. The girl child drops out of school, and there has to be a certain kind of focus. So you have a stark gender disparity, even not only in the entry and dropout rate, but also among internet users of the two most common gender. 33.3% of women 15 to 49 years have ever used the internet, whereas 57.1% of men have had access to the internet. This differential access to the internet got aggravated during the pandemic. Now, during the pandemic, we know that more girls dropped out, number of girl-child marriages increased. So, crisis always aggravates the risks that the vulnerable population in our societies face, and within the vulnerable population, the girl child is particularly placed in a disadvantaged situation. I'm just sharing some visuals again to draw attention to what are the images which come to our mind. When I say girl child, so what do I think of? So you can think of this, or you can think of the earlier one about the girl labor, or you can think of a more typical middle class picture of a little girl with her parents. So the basic idea of sharing these pictures is again to show to you that the status of the girl child would differ depending upon which society she belonged to. You could be very pampered and you could be dressed up, and today in advertisements or if you go to the malls, you would have mannequins not only dressed up as young men or women, but little children. There's a targeting for particular dresses, particular makeup, cosmetics for little girls. So you could have a pampered, privileged girl child, and you could have a dispossessed, marginalized child. There are very stark differences, but what unites them is the possibility of risks in a patriarchal society, of vulnerability to sexual assault, of being in danger if she goes out into the streets. You have other visuals which are again showing you about working labor of the girl child. How many girl child are trafficked for domestic labor as well as for sex work. This is something which comes in our news everywhere. So the crisis, the point that I've been trying to convey is there's a relationship between the vulnerability of the girl child, social structure and ideas. Second, this vulnerability becomes much more during crisis, whether it's famine, plague, earthquake, riots, war, outcry of refugees, or the pandemic. Disease outbreaks increase girls and young women's duties caring for the elderly, of family members as well as for siblings who are out of schools. Girls, especially from marginalized communities and with disabilities, may be particularly affected by the secondary impact of outbreak. And all studies have shown after COVID-19, we are just about recovering from the terrible pandemic, that this exposed girls to new risks, including child, early and forced marriage. There was an increase in the number of girl children getting married during COVID-19. There was increase in violence, increase of early pregnancy, sexual exploitation, as well as limited or no access to education when schools were closed and heightened risk of never returning. When food is scarce, girls often eat less and eat last, and in times of hunger face further risk of dropping out from school. So crisis, girl child, social structure, that relationship has to be looked at. The pandemic and the child labor. So the girl child who was going to school may have dropped out. The girl child from more privileged backgrounds may not drop out. But what happens to child labor? Girls face increased risk of gender-based violence and child labor. Economic challenges during the outbreak pose a serious threat to young women's work and business activity and expose them to increased risk of exploitation and abuse. Girls and young women face severe economic shocks, are more likely to take on high-risk work for their economic survival. They're desperate. When you're desperate, the chances of taking high-risk work is more. This is just certain data from the UNICEF, again to show to you how the COVID-19 led to missing school and the rise of work and compelled them to take on just not labor, but very often dangerous labor like brick-making industry, where the number of children who accompanied their working parents to the brick-making industry after the first wave of COVID-19 pandemic. There are data on migrant children similarly. Increase of child trafficking. Many of you may know the word child trafficking, where children are taken and their business, they're sold off. They could be sold off for sex work. They could be sold off for begging, for certain kind of maybe, making pornographic films. So there is a dangerous threat of child trafficking from families who are most vulnerable, most marginalized, and sold out for market for exploitation. Child trafficking is rampant even among refugees. Every time there is a war, every time there is a civil war, you have refugees, and the plight of girl children among the refugees is at its most vulnerable, most helplessness, and most likely to be at risk. Now, what I want to end this particular presentation is to talk about how, whereas the girl child may be differently marginalized in different societies, there is a global story. So you may have the story of the middle class Indian girl being better than the working class girl. You may have the story of the Syrian refugee being, worse off than somebody who is in the mainstream of America. But there is a pattern. There is a certain vulnerability of the girl child which we have to recognize. In pre-modern society, before we became industrialized, modernized, and entered into democratic societies, there was no language of rights. People didn't say that, look, every child, every person, whether disabled, differently abled, different genders, different caste communities have equal rights, came about with democracy. Similarly, the language of rights came and impacted the story of the girl child. So when even in the industrialist country like Britain, other countries which we now see as epitome of development had child labor at the beginning of their industrialization. If any of you have seen Oliver Twist or seen the old films and writings of Charles Dickens, there were children who worked in factories, children who worked in mines, children worked in very difficult conditions. But there were movements, and the movements were to claim the rights of these children. And therefore, you had to go back to where we began. International standards on child's rights advanced dramatically over the past century, but gaps remain in meeting those ideals. We have progressive laws, we have the rights statutes, we have an able international institution, state policies, and developmental sector. But the gaps between the law and society is very vast. And in order to change, we have to change not just the law, but an understanding has to be given. Understanding that what are the rights of the child, what are these statutes saying, and how are we going to bring it about. The UN Declaration says we have the right to social security, housing, nutrition, recreation, everything. But in actual practice, this does not take place. So it becomes very important for us to realize that we have to understand what exactly we have to do in order to meet the challenges ahead. What is the role of the media? The media has to campaign, but the media shouldn't just tell you that, look, the rights have to be defended. They have to explain what is the relationship between social structure, vulnerability, and the girl child. Who will do it? Education will do it. Education is extremely important, and therefore the role of an organization like CEC to communicate what are the reasons for these vulnerabilities. Once this is communicated, then media, states, international organizations, and NGOs can complete the story of giving the rights that the young girl child deserves to have. Thank you very much.